Good afternoon. It's great to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to introduce Professor Wakild. Emily Wakild is Professor of History and Director of Environmental Studies at Boise State University. She's born in Salt Lake, grew up in Santa Fe, and went to high school in Ontario, Oregon. She did her bachelor's degree in History and Political Science at Willamette University in Oregon, in Salem, Oregon. And after that, chose to serve with Teach for America for 3 years, where she joined them in helping to create equitable opportunities for education for all American students. So for 3 years, she taught 6th grade social studies in Weslaco, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley. Professor Wakild completed her PhD at the University of Arizona in 2007 and began her career at Wake Forest University, and then moved to Boise State, coming back west, which is home for her, in 2012. Professor Wakild's work is focused on conservation and national parks in Latin America. Her first book, entitled Revolutionary Parks, Conservation, Social Justice, and Mexico's National Parks, 1910 to 1940, broke new ground in conservation studies and history, and kind of broke up some really interesting new interpretations about the nature of conservation and national parks in Mexico, in particular in Latin America. We have a certain idea of what national parks are and how conservation works in the United States. It's a really different story. Here in the United States, it was sort of an elite project. You create these wild spaces that are often in very remote places and tend to be highly scenic, and that can be enjoyed by people that can afford a private car and a weeks-long vacation. Mexico, which by 1940 had more national parks than any other country in the world, had a different idea about what national parks were for, very much focused on social justice. So they created national parks that weren't like American parks, that is, empty. In national parks in the United States, we sort of emptied these spaces of rural peoples and indigenous peoples that we didn't want there. In Mexico, they took a different approach, and people who had been living on the land for centuries in many cases, and actually had shaped that land, remain in these national parks. And the other thing that the Mexicans did, which is really great, is they put most of their national parks right next to major cities so that everybody had access to them and could enjoy them regardless of their social status. The book won 3 prizes: the Alfred B. Thomas Prize, the Charles Weyerhaeuser Award, and the Eleanor Melville Prize. It was my privilege to be the chair on the Melville Committee that year that she won. She's also co-authored an innovative book on teaching environmental history, which is appropriate both for colleges and for high school. Her latest academic coup is publishing an article in the American Historical Review. I will not at this time tell you how hard that is to do. This is the flagship journal. It's really difficult to get into. That's kudos to you for doing that. As you'll see today, I'm sure Emily's work always has a great polish to it, a lot of grace, and a lot of precision. I think precision is the best way to describe her work. Professor Shumway sent the article around to faculty in our department, and Jeff Hardy, who's a Russianist, read it, and then he presented it to his History 200 students. This is our research and methods class, and he says, you want a model for what history's supposed to look like? This is what it's supposed to look like. You want a model for what a conclusion's supposed to look like? Go back and read the last three paragraphs. So we're really privileged to have her here with you, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming her.
That article took 6 years and had more than 18 reviews, so it is quite a story. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to Jeff Shumway and Sean Miller for inviting me to be here, and the Kennedy Center with Renata Forsti and Stan Benville, who facilitated this visit. And thank you to all the students who are here in the audience that agreed to come and listen. In the last century, a shift has occurred in how people talk about and value natural landscapes. Conversations throughout the Americas have moved from aesthetic discussions of scenery to debates about measuring diversity. This has taken place amidst a backdrop of enormous extraction and exploitation of individual and collective natural communities, a transformation of frontier settlement patterns, and a fundamental reconfiguration of basic transportation abilities, and the uneven social and political processes that triggered and maintained the expansion of these biotic exchanges that remade nature and culture on scales beyond those witnessed in previous human times. As these modes of knowing these changes were happening and shifted, the landscapes below them shifted as well. Except in certain charismatic places where this didn't happen. Some landscapes were set aside, spared, removed, and taken out of this rapid transformation strategically by nation states. And this is a map of what this footprint looks like in South America. It amounts to about 25% of the land uses. All of the light gray shadings are national parks or their equivalent in protected areas. The dark ones that are labeled are the case studies in my own work, and then the larger areas are the ecological and social regions that I'm looking at, Amazonia and Patagonia more broadly. So often, these resources that were set aside had little economic value. Frequently, the set-asides were little more than a circle drawn on a map, but by calling these places parks, natural evolution was set upon a separate path, and the society around the parks was similarly, often slowly, transformed. Some parks, especially those in Patagonia, became tourist meccas, bringing hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue to regions once dismissed as useless, save for sheep farming. Others, like Jau in the Brazilian Amazon, remain hardly visited except by those who live within the park. The convergence of science and conservation reworked both the cultural and physical geography of South America in the 20th century, and in doing so, it created concepts of great value that continue to drive discourses about nature and also drive the processes that are shaping nature as well. This set of changes I've just described to you does not obviously include animals, especially wild or feral animals, but most of what I'll talk to you about today is why it should, and some of the reasons why it can include these animals and why I think it should. I have 3 observations to make and a premise that comes out of them. I'm not going to specifically talk about penguins, but if you don't like my observations and premise, they're fun to look at, so you can, you can focus on the background. My first observation is kind of an obvious one, right? Animals always accompany people in colonial projects, and these animals mutually co-produce new landscapes, new relationships, and new communities, including the animals. And my examples here will be the horse and the huemul, a native Patagonian deer. Their relationship between the horse and the huemul is hidden in plain sight. The second observation that I make is that European scientists found animals in Patagonia mysterious and difficult to explain. And here I'll talk a little bit about the Mylodon, or a Pleistocene ground sloth. And the comparison here is really to Africa. In contrast to Africa, European scientists saw Latin American animals as mysterious and fantastical rather than something to hunt and conquer. And the third observation is that debates about animals became debates about conservation and debates about resources. And here I'll look at the puma in Torres del Paine National Park. So the larger takeaway from this, or the premise that I think this adds up to, and I would love to hear at the end if you have different conclusions, is that conservation serves to translate and convey to the public difficult scientific concepts. And this translation makes conservation the most important conduit of scientific knowledge about animals and about the landscape. And we rarely interpret conservation areas or national parks as doing that work of translation. But alone, that isn't enough. We need history and historians to add context to the ways that translation can be progressive or can be problematic. Okay, so the first observation that animals were brought along starts in a pretty obvious place, right? So Europeans, the Spanish, brought domesticated animals with them to the Americas. And this is just one example drawn of many that could be displayed of a Spaniard on a horse, right, riding through Latin America. This was part of the portmanteau biota that Alfred Crosby wrote about 50 years ago. So not just the actual animals, but the ideas and culture surrounding those animals that was brought to the Americas. The cow and, of course, the sheep were economic commodities. They were an end, but the horse was more of a means to that end, right? The cows were the product that provided the leather, the tallow, the meat, but the horse managed the cows. So set to roam, horses, like the cattle, could become wild, but also important was the transfer of the use and the utility of these animals to other people in other places. And here is where the Mapuche, or sort of a general term referred to originally to the people that originally lived in large pieces of Patagonia, referred to by the Spanish as the Araucanos or the Araucanians. But the people of the Patagonian plains and forest are one of those places where horses became a strategic mode of resistance, actually against the Spanish. And one way that the Mapuche could incorporate horses was to become skilled horse riders and use the animals to raid or evade the Spanish occupation. So much so that the horse can't be seen simply as a European tool or a European animal. This is true of the Comanche and the Apache in the north, but it's also true of the Mapuche in the south. And this was a fundamental way they could resist Spanish colonialism by incorporating the horse into their culture. And some would say they still use the horse to resist state violence today. This is a demonstration against building dams in Patagonia, and it's not insignificant that the protesters are all mounted on horses. They were successful at getting these dams not built, essentially. But here I'd like to introduce you to a different animal, in some ways the counterpoint to the horse, and this is the huemul, a deer native to Argentina and Chile, and an animal with great mystique, especially around the time of independence from Spain. Often described as an elusive and secretive animal, the animal was known to exist, or was proved eventually to exist, but it was rarely seen, and this was importantly claimed to be a national animal for Chile. It appeared on the shield, original versions of the flag, and the huemul demonstrated this sort of idea of a true republic. This is the shield as it exists today and was finally approved. And the huemul serves to illustrate this relationship between a natural reality and the historic and institutional evolution of a country. It was described, and the image here is from the Jesuit priest Juan Ignacio Molina, who's the first naturalist of Chile, who said that the huemul is the most wild and strange that there is in Chile. He does not let himself be seen among the rocks and cliffs of the Cordillera. He rarely descends into the more interior valleys from said mountain, and a hunter who surprised him would be quite content. But Claudio Guy, the French naturalist hired by the Chilean government to catalog Chile's flora and fauna, took critique on Molina's fantastic description that sounded to him more like a horse. And indeed, the early drafts of the shield featured what can only be described as a horse, not a huemul. So the fact that a shy and timid animal that flees in the face of any danger was chosen to represent a republic is contradictory, right, on the face, but then to have no idea what this rare and elusive animal looks like itself proved a problem. So the huemul, nevertheless, persists as a representation of the Chilean nation, and these representations continue to the present day. So these are a few samples from Coyhaique in southern Chile. This is a wall-size mural done on cowhide in the Coyhaique airport featuring the huemul. The symbol is, of course, used for the Ministry of Agriculture. This I quite enjoy is literally the mug shots of individual huemuls and their ages as identified in Torres del Paine National Park. But this one is my favorite, which is a renewed interpretation of John Deere. So there's clearly an estimation of the significance of the huemul despite the somewhat elusive pedigree. But here's where the animals meet, and I think this is the place where scientific studies provide us with insight into how these animals change each other. A series of scientific studies on the postcranial morphology show that the huemul can't be associated with rock climbing species. In other words, the animal is unlike the ibex or the bighorn sheep in terms of its physiology. It falls more closely in line with cervids that use lowlands and flatlands and grasslands. And to quote one of the more recent articles, the paleoecology, zoogeography, and land use history in southern South America indicate that the mountain huemul is a secondary relic created by impacts of post-Columbian colonization. Most likely, then, the huemul is a deer of the plains that was chased into the mountains for refuge by the Mapuche using the horse. And that means that this animal on the national shield has less to do with any sort of wild or prehistoric nature and more to do with the ways Native people transformed the lives of Native animals using European animals. And it's likely that the objects of and instruments for smuggling through the Andes, the cattle and the horses introduced from Europe, had pushed the huemul off the plains long before permanent settlers and national parks arrived on the scene. This becomes important in the 20th century because in the 1970s, the Chilean government embarks on a restoration plan for the huemul. But to where should the huemul be restored, right? Where should they go? Okay, so the second point that I made was that European scientists were puzzled by Patagonian animals. And if the huemul is the rare and mysterious animal that actually lived but nobody ever saw, the Melodon is the counterpoint, a long extinct animal that scientists sought to situate on the Patagonian landscape. This animal was a Pleistocene ground sloth. The first description from bones found in northern Argentina was drawn by Richard Owen in 1840, but a series of events happened in the late 1890s in Patagonia that brought the animal into line with scientific debates over the Americas and over extinction in particular. On a bright, windy morning in late November of 1897, the Argentine scientist and creator of the first national park in Argentina, Francisco Moreno, wrapped himself in a guanaco hide poncho and followed a local sailor up the punctuated hillside to this cave, Consuelo Cave, on Last Hope Inlet. The cave is today a Chilean natural monument, but at this time, no one was sure whether the cave was in Chile or Argentina. Moreno found himself in this far southern latitude as part of his work overseeing surveyors conducting preliminary studies of the boundary line between the two countries. But at this moment, his primary interest was not topography. He inquired in the small settlement about a rumor he'd heard from an Argentine naval officer about a mysterious piece of animal skin found 2 years earlier. As Moreno climbed up and reached the cave, he confirmed the rumors. He had looked up into the tree and found hanging a large piece of dried skin where it had been left, most likely by Hermann Eberhard, an itinerant German sailor who turned into a sheep farmer there. Covered with the dust of a tertiary conglomerate, as he described it, the skin was noticeable because of the small, bony tubercles throughout it and the lack of an accompanying skeleton. These are the images from Moreno's first publication on the animal. Moreno and his party retrieved the skin, and they brought it back to town where the inhabitants looked on it as an interesting curiosity. Some believed it was the hide of a cow that had somehow gotten encrusted with pebbles. Others thought it was a marine animal, probably some unknown species of seal. But Moreno, on the other hand, drew up on his vast experience observing Patagonia and his work as the director of the nation's first scientific gallery at the Museum of La Plata, and his deep network of discussions with other scientists had determined that this was a Megalodon, an ancient giant ground sloth, and the tubercles served as a sort of armor in the animal's fur. Moreno saw the skin in the place where the animal likely lived, but then he removed it for further study, and his observations circulated through the knowledge he'd gathered for decades around the region as they tried to identify the specimen's date. Moreno initially believed that this species had lived within the historical epoch and had only disappeared quite recently, certainly during human habitation of the area. He noted that elsewhere in Patagonia, he had found Megalodon and human remains on the spot in identical layers of soil. And in another cave, Moreno observed paintings that resembled another Pleistocene extinct animal, the Glyptodon, which is essentially a tortoise the size of a Volkswagen bug. Furthermore, Moreno had personally spoken with Tehuelche and Janacan peoples who mentioned similar animals chronicled by their ancestors. The atmosphere of the caves was not deep, and Moreno deduced that without exposure to the elements, excellent preservation could occur, but he believed that it was more likely that the skin represented a more recent, within decades, extinction. And this was characteristic of Moreno's thoughts, not just on the megafauna, but on much of the geology of Patagonia as a whole. The landscape and its contents were ancient, but also constantly changing at a pace that people could and did observe. Such an approach to this geographic dynamism could only be developed through his depth of expertise in the region. Fierce debates over the Megalodon erupted. More than 200 scientific articles drawn from research at this cave were published, and the skin circulated around the world. This is the sample that was sent to Teddy Roosevelt and that he wrote thanking Moreno for, saying it was the most prized of his whole collection of natural history specimens. This is the sample that resides in the Museum of Natural History in Berlin. But the Megalodon marks a shift in European science of Latin America because of the increasing importance of the site. So not simply removing the artifacts and studying them in the museum, but needing to preserve and study the place where they came from and protect what happened there. Because of this, the site was designated a historic monument in 1968. The Megalodon figures in important works of natural history through the 20th century. And it was also featured as the opening touchstone in Bruce Chatwin's classic 1970s book In Patagonia that sets him off on his journey because his grandmother had ended up with a piece of Megalodon skin. Okay, so the final observation that I want to make for you is that debates about animals also became debates about conservation and resources. And if the whale was misunderstood and deeply changed by the horse and a horse's owners, and the Megalodon was mysterious yet set in a particular landscape, the scientific study of the puma links the wild animals to national parks more directly. Anybody know what park this is? Torres del Paine, right? So this is my quick Google of Torres del Paine. These are all the pictures that come up. And this is what it actually looks like. Torres del Paine is Chile's premier national park. It was created in 1959, and it's set amongst an unbelievably stunning scenic backdrop. It's the site also for some really important transitions in scientific understandings of how animals shape landscapes and how they are shaped by them. The traveler, Lady Florence Dixie, was the first tourist to visit the towers in 1888, or the sort of first official one to think of herself that way. And importantly, in the decades between Dixie's tour and the park's creation, numerous enterprises of introduction took place all over Patagonia. So these enterprises of introduction brought largely European or North American animals and set them free with the hopes hopes that they would become lucrative enterprises. So European hares and rabbits is one of those. Beavers famously were flown down from Canada by the Argentine government. You can watch it on YouTube, I'm not kidding, and you can see them set free. Salmon were brought in boxes designed by Federico Albert, Chile's first forester, and wild boar, European elk, and numerous other species were sort of set free. Such so, and so many of these enterprises of introduction went out into the Patagonia landscape that there are some scientists that say there is nothing native left in that landscape. At the same time, Torres del Paine has an enormous footprint in terms of its size. It takes up 160,000 hectares and has been denounced and was denounced as early as the 1960s by ranchers as the zone that stores a population of pumas responsible for damaging my sheep. And so the state in Chile commissioned a study of the diet of the puma in the late 1970s, which was published in the early 1980s. And this was a big study. There were 18 different areas in the national park and the immediate vicinity that were studied, and they looked into what the animals ate. They looked for evidence in scat, in remains of prey, in footprints, in recorded sightings. And they determined that the puma can cover a great distance. So some of the understanding of them was that they could cover up to 40 kilometers in a single night's activity as they were looking for food. And they reported that the puma did 3 types of principal eating. In the park, the puma ate primarily the introduced hares, the European hares. Next, they ate birds, and the last, which is what the scientists thought they would eat the most of, were the native guanaco, or the sort of wild llama species. In the ranching communities, the pumas also ate hares primarily. They did eat sheep and wild birds as well. And then there was a third category of complementary species that fluctuated during the year, rodents and fox and opportunistic reptiles and those sorts of things. But in all sectors, 72% of the puma's diet was made up of introduced species. So even though the puma is native, its diet adjusted to the entry of other wild but not native species. So even in conservation areas, introduced species support wild populations. This was good news for the ranchers, right, and for the people that didn't want the ranchers to have a leg to stand on to get rid of the park. But it also changes the way we think about how animals are classified. And here a map from the Argentine government's first and only, and I think Argentina is the only country to ever conduct a study comprehensively of all of their fauna. And in this image, they have demonstrated the native fauna in red and with amazing profiles of the shape of the animals, and the exotic fauna, or the introduced fauna, in blue. You might notice that all of the blue fauna, all of the exotics, are invading from Chile. But this classification doesn't take into account how the puma live off the exotic animals, right? Or the symbiosis and relationships among both the native and exotic fauna. Okay, so I would like to conclude then with a famous traveler, Ernesto Che Guevara. This probably most famous picture, but this one indicates the source of these writings. Guevara and his traveling companion, Alberto Granados, rode their motorcycle through at least 3 national parks in Patagonia during the austral summer of 1952. They befriended park rangers, they camped along lake shores, and they marveled at the majestic landscape and the touristic infrastructure. Hardly the activities of notorious communist insurrectionists, Guevara Guevara and Granados mostly behaved like the 20-something yahoos that they were. They climbed peaks, they swam in lakes, they watched aggressive car races, they overindulged in wine and at several lively barbecues. But between these capers, they observed classic and exceptional attributes of the Patagonian wild. They marveled at deer, they shot a duck for dinner, they imagined a puma attack, and the soon-to-be revolutionaries and the wild animals they encountered that in this landscape, both could meet because the parks existed there. After climbing a peak and becoming disappointed in the absence of a large, broad panorama, Guevara and Granados watched a wild deer, most likely the huemul, navigate a treacherous crossing. The huge figure of a stag dashed like a quick breath across the stream, and his body, silver by the light of the rising moon, disappeared into the undergrowth. This tremor of nature cut straight through to our hearts. The deer encounter then inspired the pair to appreciate the tranquility they found in the mountains and to adjust their cadence. Guevara claimed, "We walked slowly so as not to disturb the peace of the wild sanctuary with which we were now community." He went so far as to dream of returning to this magical landscape in the shade of immense trees where wilderness had arrested the advance of civilization in order to build a clinic someday. Guevara waxed nostalgic about the majestic ungulate and the wild landscape, but he took seriously the warnings of an Austrian couple that the puma, unafraid of attacking people, stalked the night alongside and around their campsite. After this grave warning, Guevara awoke to the sound of an animal sniffing and scratching just beyond the shed where they had lied to rest for the night. He reached for his pistol and he fired into the fierce green eyes before identifying that the animal in question was the mongrel mutt of his hosts. Defending his instincts while recognizing the brutality of his unthinking action, Guevara empathized with the stentorian shouts of the caretaker and the wife's hysterical sobs at the discovery of their murdered pooch. The characteristic empathy that Guevara develops for his fellow Americans on this journey extends, in this instance, to his own unthinking act of cowardice in reaction to the threat of a wild carnivore. His thick descriptions of the thunder beyond the walls and the midnight rain contributed to the mirage that merged wild and domestic threats, just as the elements of Patagonia's weather form the backdrop of its landscape. So embedded in these deer and puma encounters were other animal bodies that further suggest that the nature preserved in these parks was far from pristine or untouched. The park ranger provided the sheepskin for the men to sleep upon, a common luxury that nevertheless aggravated Guevara's sensitive asthma. The men hunted a duck, ignoring the restrictions placed on waterfowl in order to meet their need for sustenance. The dog that lost its life when mistaken for a puma and the horses, as well as the cattle slaughtered for many of the barbecues, were also indicative of widespread biotic transformations in this landscape, including and alongside the human communities. The other indications, such as the mention of a well-trodden bridle path used by local smugglers to cross over into Chile, or the overgrown willow patch where larger populations of deer or rodents may have once grazed, suggest the centuries of transformation had etched their evolutionary shifts onto the terrestrial ecosystem. But parks brought people to Patagonia. This is apparent in more than just the two men on the motorcycle. Guevara and Granados encountered a husband and wife, stoical pair, they called them, living out of their backpacks and tents alongside the lake. And later, they stopped to have their pictures taken with an environmentalist couple from Europe. Far from solo tourists, they meet others of their similar class and quest to find themselves in travel and in the acute but fleeting suffering that nature might bring to them. As testified by the glimpses of the non-human actors, these parks simultaneously created and maintained conditions where much of the non-human nature could carry on. So broadly, Che's experiences suggest conservation created infrastructure to bring young men to the wild and to ensure that something complicated lived there for them to see. So I want to return to my initial premise that through conservation, scientific concepts and scientific knowledge are conveyed to the public, and that conservation as such serves as an important conduit of scientific concepts. We see this in thinking about how the horse changed the Wemu, how the absence of the Miladon changed the floristic makeup of the area around the monument, and also changed scientific thinking, and how the European hares changed the diet of the puma and likely also its behavior. And so what Guevara and Granados experienced even in the 1950s was a multi-species assemblage nested in a particular time and place, but always changing. Thank you so much for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions.
So we're recording this, and there are also some people in overflow. So we'll ask you to, if you have a question, please come to the microphone, introduce yourself to our speaker, tell us your name, what you're studying, and then ask your question. We know that in about 10 minutes, some of you will have to get up and go to class, so if you need to do that, please do that as quietly as you can. But time is now yours for your questions, please.
Hi, my name is Bailey and I'm studying Spanish. My question is, at the beginning you talked about how there was a difference between how Europeans treated American animals and then African animals. And I was wondering why you think that difference came about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Bailey. Great question. So a lot of European conservation in Africa was driven by really sort of two factors. One of them that was the existence of European colonies in Africa at the same time conservation areas and parks were being built, or immediately preceding that colonization. That the same case is not true in Latin America. Latin American countries that created national parks were independent nations, right? And that had, in most cases, been so for more than 100 years. And so that political distinction of sovereignty matters when you're thinking about what's being conserved and for who, for what public. And then the second reason that Europeans were interested in conservation in Africa was because of the Big Five or the big game in general. So Europeans wanted Kruger National Park in South Africa to be full of lions and elephants and things that they could shoot and bring back to London, right? And that process of supporting hunting was very much from the beginning a part of conversations about conservation. It's also true in North America that Teddy Roosevelt loved to shoot things, right? Shooting a buffalo was sort of the baseline for his stature, right? He had to do it before he was president. And that role matters, but there aren't nearly as many large animals and extra large animals in Latin America or in the Americas in general, largely because most of them went extinct in the Pleistocene, just like the Miladon. But the other piece of it is that the tropical landscapes in Latin America are really difficult to hunt in, right? So you can't shoot a monkey in the Amazon unless you've grown up firing arrows at that monkey, right? And it's a much more difficult enterprise to do episodically and for sort of a wealthy, elite, leisurely pursuit. And that distinction has really shaped how people think about conservation, because going to Latin America to shoot things did not become nearly as large of a fad as it did in Africa, and less so, but also in South Asia. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, my name is Ignacio Garcia. I'm a professor of history here. When I was in Cuba a few years ago, I was told about this magnificent national park they had. It was a tourist attraction. I was just wondering, did Che have anything to do with any kind of national parks or anything in Cuba that you know of?
Not that I know of, but we don't know very much about national parks in the Caribbean in general. So that's a great question. I don't know if he was involved at all, and my understanding is that most national parks came in Cuba in the 1970s. So that would be sort of after him. But if he wrote about it or inspired it in any way, I don't know, but it would be interesting to see. He did write about nature more than you think he would. And people that have written biographies of him or sort of written about him, he's such a polarizing figure that part of his writing has never really figured into it. I mean, I had taught the book twice before I read it and was like, wait a second, what he's talking about are national parks. And he talks about the national parks in the text. He also, when he, after the trip, he goes to Guatemala for a while and then leaves Guatemala and goes to Mexico, and he climbs the highest peaks in Mexico that were national parks at the time too. And he writes about that experience as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was in some of his work, but I've never looked into it. It's a great question. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Paul. I'm studying English, but with minors in Latin American studies and history. And just a quick open-ended question. You mentioned Darwin in the slides, but we didn't talk too much about his studies, especially in Patagonia. Just your thoughts on his work and how that influenced maybe European and other thought in Argentina and Latin America.
Yeah, great question. So I did cut out the Darwin part. And I apologize that, but I thought the Miladon made a better pairing. So I have a section where I talk about European science in Patagonia, and I actually start with a Malaspina expedition, which is a Spanish scientific expedition that was monumental and is largely overshadowed in most literature by Darwin. And the Malaspina expedition really chronicled the animals and the shorelines of Patagonia and has some pretty fantastic descriptions of Guanaco in particular. And what is important about the Malaspina is that although it's a scientific expedition at the service of the Spanish Empire and intended to chronicle but also account for what is there, it's also creative and takes real liberties with assessing what that science is good for or what those inventories can serve. And Malaspina and the people that wrote for him, because there were 75 naturalists or something employed over the course of the expedition, despised Patagonia. He thought it was valueless. He thought it was a landscape that was depauperate and desolate and kind of disgusting. So he didn't see any potential there. And what's important is not that Darwin was the first, because he describes a lot of the things that already had been described, but that he says, wow, this is really interesting. People could make a go at this. And that becomes the impetus for a lot of downward settlement from Argentina and Chile. Finally, there's a European scientist that's saying Patagonia might be worth something. There's a lot that's been written in particular about the Darwin expedition and Fitzroy before him and their relationship to the people that they encounter. And that's a really important story. Fitzroy kidnaps Fuegians and takes them back to London, teaches them how to dress properly and use a knife and a fork, and then feels so guilty he returns them back to Patagonia and sets them free. And he and Darwin encounter someone who's named by them Jemmy Button, who had lost all trappings of civilization in their estimation. He no longer dressed in a European style. He'd forgotten how to say all but a couple phrases in English. And this for them is sort of two things. I mean, one, it's part of the cataloging of what exists there because they're including the people they encounter in that scientific list, but it's also this testament to civilization not being permanent. and the tragedy that unfolds with that. And it haunts Fitzroy to the end of his life. It's part of the reason he commits suicide and really looks back on the work that he's done with sort of a difficult lens. But Darwin's descriptions of the Wanako and of native uses of the animal, the dung for fire, for example, are much more promising than Malaspina, and so Darwin opens up that kind of valuation, and that was the descriptions, the comparative descriptions of the Wanako got cut. So thank you, Paul, for the question.
Hi, I'm Riley Nelson. I'm a biologist here,
Oh, good.
and I love Patagonia. Darwin also, the reason that I just lost his, Richard Owen
Yeah.
could describe Mylodon is because Darwin took him specimens from further north up on La Plata.
Yeah.
So that's one angle, and the Glyptodon made a big impression on Darwin, and he talked about that in his works as well. Giant armadillo might be a better approximation than
Than a
giant
tortoise.
tortoise.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, there's a lot of archaeology that's available in Patagonia at the lowlands and the highlands. Do we know if there's any huemul in any of that archaeology, and whether the people were using huemul at the same time they were using Wanako? And anyway, there's a whole bunch of questions here. Do you know anything about the archaeology of people finding huemul at the lowlands to support the biomechanic argument?
I don't. I know there are a few studies and of archaeological sites. The Instituto de la Patagonia has published them since the 1970s, and that's an excellent point. I need to go back and see if the huemul is in those. It's been a while since I've read them, and I've never cross-checked that point, so I appreciate that.
And I wasn't aware on the seal of Chile, there's the huemul on one side and the condor on the other side.
Yeah.
What was the condor eating?
Everything.
Yeah. That's an important
Yeah.
problem that we're facing right now with our own species of condor
Absolutely.
here.
Absolutely.
One of the famous quotes from Darwin's trip on the Argentine side up on the Santa Cruz with
Yeah.
Fitzroy
Yeah.
was that today I shot a condor. And then he went ahead and described that, and I could consider how many biologists nowadays reading that from Darwin would put him in a different category than your God or whatever. But you should probably look as part of your history as this goes on. With the seal the way it is, the condor had to be feeding on something as well. Yeah. And there's probably somebody that's done that study.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In the Lady Florence Dixie slide, the condor is eating the horse carcass. So you can sort of see one of the samples, you can see them flying over. And but that's an excellent point.
And the condor down there is on many seals and in many government places.
Absolutely.
In many countries. And it's going through many of the same problems we have here. And yet I was very excited that on a trip to Ecuador in August that there were condor flying around Cotopaxi, which made me feel good.
Yeah, thank you so much.
My name's Hovan, and I'm a history major here at BYU. So you said that the puma got more to eat through the hare being introduced, but were there other native animals, Hetoris alpina, that were crowded out by the arrival of these new species?
So in the case of the hare, there are a few studies of the destruction of vegetation. So the things getting crowded out are insects, essentially, by the decline in the vegetation because of the hare. And they're, just as the Argentines depict the exotic animals is invading from Chile. The Chilean scientists that have written the studies of the hare say they're all coming from Argentina, and that Chile's contained their population, but they keep repopulating from over the border. So one of the interesting things ways of thinking about, especially the Chilean side of Patagonia, is thinking of it like an island. And it's experienced kind of an island biogeographic effect on extinctions, but also on just this general volume of animals that have existed there. And one of the ways Patagonia is often portrayed as sort of the end of the earth, right? The last place humans got to, the last place animals got to, sort of everything that was left over ended up there. And so one way of thinking about that is that there was less to displace than there were on other islands or in other places. And there certainly are native species that people care very deeply about, but in comparison, and this is where I hope the final product, which is a comparison of Patagonia and Amazonia, is really meaningful because the Amazon is so extremely biodiverse. And Patagonia has the most diverse mosses and lichens in the world. But when we think about animals, it isn't actually all that valuable. And there's some Chilean scientists that argue it's overprotected. That because it's pretty, there are too many parks there, and there should be more parks right outside Santiago where there are more species and they get overused. Yeah.
Thank
Great
you.
question. Thanks, Ovan.
My name is Nanette. I'm a biology major. I was just kind of curious as you were talking about how you think the concept of conservation has changed throughout history and what you think the projected future of conservation is.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nana. Thank you. I want more biologists to be conservation biologists. So thank you for being here and for asking that. So one of the things that I'm always interested in about conservation is it's broadly appealing. It's appealing to nations, right? It's a way to kind of communicate your modern status is by having national parks, but it's also appealing to lots of people and on just a instinctive and a practical level. And there have been many critiques of conservation, largely coming out of Africa and North America, about conservation as a tool of displacement and conservation as a mechanism of taking land away from, especially indigenous peoples, but rural people. And it's an important argument, and I am aligned with the politics behind that critique. But the difficulty for me is that, yes, parks have done that, but so have enormous private ranches. And so have places like Manhattan. And so have like everywhere that we live. And so if we're gonna hold parks to a higher standard for justice, then why aren't we also holding some of these other places responsible for that as well? And I think the story in Latin America is less about kicking people out, and there are lots of different ways that it plays out. So Chile has one of the most well-developed private nature conservation networks in the world, and some of this is famous and somewhat controversial. So Douglas Tompkins was the inventor of North Face equipment. He married the designer that founded Esprit Clothing. They lived in San Francisco until the mid-90s where they got divorced, and Tompkins took his $100 million down to Patagonia and bought up land and made it national parks, and he's now given almost 2 million acres back to the Chilean government to create national parks. And there are Chileans that say, how would Americans feel if a Chilean, bought up this land and divided their country in half with a conservation area? Or, he's taking these lands that we could develop and build a robust economy out of economic circulation. But then there are others that think what he's doing is inspirational for them. So conservation is often controversial, but it is continually and perpetually popular, and it often works. So I think that the critique of human value and the human lives and animal lives is really crucial to how we think about what the future might look like, and I hope that we can see those things as compatible And I think that the parks in Latin America give us a number of examples for how we might do that. The final critique of conservation that I think is important to point out is that conservation out there, so in Yellowstone, in the Amazon, in South Africa, is a way of letting people off the hook for their behavior in here. So in cities and in places far away from that. And I think that that's true to a certain extent, but it's also better than nothing, right? The answer to that is not to not have conservation, right? It's to think more deeply about what we do here that affects it as well. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Heather, and I'm a wildlife and wildlands conservation major. Yeah, and
That's a cool major.
it's an awesome major. Yeah,
I didn't.
I hope to go into environmental law afterwards, and kind of what you're explaining afterward about is how complicated it is, because whenever there is a true environmental issue, it also includes economic issues, and it also includes social issues, human rights. And so I really liked your thesis when you talked about, you said it is through conservation that scientific concepts are conveyed to the public in the state, and this translation has made conservation the most important conduit of scientific concepts as they relate to animals and landscapes. So what scientific concepts, if you were to go to a national park, what scientific concepts would you feel are most important to be conveyed to the population, and why?
So I think we should have a biologist to answer that part, but I will say that the ones that I think have been answered from a historical perspective are the best example is biodiversity. And so in the United States, the debate about wilderness, or the role of wilderness and the American mind, or wilderness and the American West, and sort of the shaping of the concept of a romantic and majestic land that exists without people, has been a fundamental component of becoming American. Right? It's been very much baked into how people understand what the U.S. is and how it functions in the world, and wilderness is, largely resonant with many populations, rural or urban or suburban. And yet there's no there's no translation for wilderness in Spanish. There's no translation linguistically.
There's not. Just the other day, I was trying to tell my Spanish teacher that I was going out to the desierto to work with the deer, and she was like, "You're going to the desert?" Because in the Book of Mormon, that's how they say
that's
wilderness.
How they say it. That's exactly what, and that's the closest approximation, and it doesn't have the cultural weight. Right? It doesn't have that sort of romanticism behind it. And so one of the things that I've found in the research for this book is that biodiversity has taken the place of the idea of wilderness for Latin American countries. So if you talk to a Peruvian about why they have national parks, they'll say, because we have the most biodiversity in the world. Wow. Right? And that, the person probably has no idea what biodiversity means, or how to explain alpha diversity, and or any of the ways that biodiversity is actually measured or cataloged or understood, but they know it's valuable. And it has a cachet that goes beyond this singular sort of North American translation of wilderness. And for me, that's the work conservation has done. Right? So it's given both a metric, but it's also changed how conservation has extended its reach to populations that wouldn't be seduced by wilderness in the same way, and that don't have the experience of landscapes being wild and pristine because no one lives there. Like, that would be ridiculous. So the term biodiversity, as it came in, and there were many, many Latin American biologists that were on the forefront of this. So in Brazil, the Institute for the Study of the Amazon did some of the earliest work on how biodiversity could be measured and what it meant, and trained generations of graduate students to come out of their programs and do that. And it's that work that has really allowed science to take place in places where diversity could be understood. Yeah, that's a great question.
That's a really cool response. Thank you.
You're
I like
very
that. Food for thought.
Very quickly,
Please.
on my work in Patagonia, I don't know the answer. I was working on the Argentine side in Glaciares
Yeah.
and down from Nahuel Huapi.
Yeah.
When did the Argentine parks come online?
Nahuel Huapi is the first in Latin America. So 1903, Perito Moreno writes a letter.
So Perito Moreno is part of.
He's the beginning. There is great controversy whether that should be marked with 1903 when he donates the land back to the government and says, create the National Park of the South, if it's 1917 where there's actually a budget, give it to the park, or if it's 1922 when the Argentine National Park Service is created. But those are the three sort of founding dates, and Argentina is the first one in South America. And if you go with the I have an article where I get into sort of all of the debates over who was first and you know, who are the founders and those sorts of things, because those questions matter.
It was wonderful. I had my colleagues that arranged to go with me, but they're in charge. It's their country. They were from La Plata and up in BA, up in Buenos Aires. But we got into El Calafate, the night of the biggest music festival in southern South America, in Patagonia. And there were more Chilean license plates on the cars than there were Argentines at that time.
Yeah.
I don't know how they were getting over the mountains from Chile right there, but they were. But at that time, it was a year and a half ago, at this music festival, there was a fellow named Luis Fonsi. Luis Fonsi was singing, and I was very happy that at that same time that Luis Fonsi was singing, there had been an arrangement, and they had made our Argentine people talk about the stonefly, the bug, the insect, on the glaciers that we were talking about, and we had a crowd that could outcompete Luis Fonsi. So there is hope in this world.
There is.
And it doesn't necessarily need to come from something as big as a breadbasket or whatever.
Yeah, it doesn't.
And the Glaciares National Park has this stonefly. That's the things I study. That is their totem. And as soon as we got off of the mountain, off of the glacier, where this thing lives, National Argentine Radio, whatever its real name is, heard that we were up there, got out and sponsored us and had a live coast to coast or north to south hour talking about stoneflies. That could never happen in the United States. So I'm proud of Argentina.
That's fantastic. I would love to read your stuff on the stonefly too. I don't have any insects in my animal menagerie. Yes, please.
Hi.
Last question.
My name is Rachel. I'm a psychology major. I was just wondering, so you said you were working on publishing something with Patagonia and Amazonia. So is it kind of in regards to this premise that you were talking about today, or is your research in the Amazon different?
It is. It is this same premise. I'm trying out on you the argument for the book. So that's what's behind it. I thought that it would be useful to kind of control for temperate ecosystems and tropical ecosystems, to bring into the comparison 4 different countries. You could bring in more with the Amazon, but I just picked Brazil and Peru. And this was a really naive design because national parks are made by nations, right? But I thought it would be getting out of the sort of reifying national park nations as the conduits for conservation, and really the starting with a national park presupposes that you have to talk about what national culture has supported those things. Yeah, so the Amazon parks are a little bit different. One of them looks at a scientific research station that's developed in Peru and is the site for most of our knowledge about neotropical primates. And then the Amazon example looks at Pleistocene refuge theory, basically a debunked scientific theory that became the platform for the design of Amazonian protection. So it's been proven not to be accurate by pollen samples and sort of new technologies and measuring floristics, but it nevertheless provided the blueprint for protecting 10 million acres in the Amazon. So the Amazon ones get a little bit more sort of modern, and the diversity argument comes out a little better in those, but it's part of the same comparison.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, join me in thanking Mr. Wakild one more time.